Hi everyone, Hyoka here. Back from Ascent Niagara with my top 16 wind arcane rye run. It's been a hectic journey and I feel a little bit rejuvenated and I kind of want to go over my deck choice, my thoughts on the meta, my experience at Ascent Niagara. So without further ado, let's begin. So I call this a very fortuitous run for a multiple reason. Not just because I run Fortuitous Wind Spirit, but also because this run basically it could have not happened at all. When I left work on Friday to go to the airport and I realized when I arrived at Buffalo, I had forgotten my passport, or at least in my mind I had forgotten. During the lift ride to the border, I was scrambling. I was thinking, do they accept a photocopy of a passport plus driver's license to go through, or what can be done at this point? Because there's no way I could fly back and then fly into Buffalo again before matches started. So I started panicking, and then I was thinking, well, where is my passport? And I thought there was a chance that it could still be in my bag because I never got my passport out of my bag since Ascent Singapore. And lo and behold, when I checked my bag, it was in there. And I just breathed a huge sigh of relief that I was able to make it to the venue, that I was able to complete all the trades that I had set up in advance, that I was able to realize the money I spent on the ticket at the event and my airfare. So I came in with a nothing to lose mentality because just being at the event, I felt like I had already won. And maybe that caused me to loosen up a bit and be able to play some pretty good Grand Archive. So here's my final placement. I finished 7-2-3 in 15th place. When you look at the top 16 decks out there, for the most part, they're level 3 decks that Rye can feast on. And I think if I played a little better, if I got squeezed one extra win from somewhere and was able to make it to the top 8, I mean, I don't think it's unreasonable to say that Windride could win the event. But given the matchups that I had, given the way that I played, I felt 7-2-3 was a very fair result, and I'm very happy with the result. I expected myself to make it to day 2 as long as I can avoid early matchup troubles, but I wasn't really expecting to contend as closely as I did for the top 8 spot. So it was a pleasant surprise, and overall, very happy with the performance. And I'll go a little bit more into my thoughts on the meta and the deck. So Ascent Niagara meta turned out to be about what I expected, between Crux at about a quarter of the meta, and then I would say the other quarter of the meta was Shadow Strike, Dragon, and Umbra Guardian. You can add them together, and it's about 50% of the meta being level 3 decks, 50% of the meta being more aggressive decks. In a longer form tournament like Ascent, where you got to go through 12 rounds of Swiss, I felt as long as I can keep myself around the top tables over the course of the event, the aggro decks kind of have less consistency, and I think they falter a bit more in a longer, drawn out event. So my hope was, and along with Crux more suppressing those decks between Flame Sweep and just in general, they've got the defense to keep the aggro decks at bay. That once I make it into the top tables later on into the event, I would have real winning chances at getting into the top 8. I kind of squeaked through on day 1 where I needed a win in, and fortunately, it was against Merlin, which is one of the most favorable matchups that Rye has. And I would say the matchups that I did face was really gave me a chance to make it to top 8. I just felt a little bit short. I would say this meta didn't really surprise me too much. I think that Razor Gale was a little bit higher than I would have thought in representation, and Water Allies was a little bit less than I thought. But overall, it was pretty much as expected, and I build my deck essentially for this meta. Now, my matchup spread on Win Fortuitous Spirit, this is kind of what I was aiming for going into the event. I felt with level 3 decks, at worst, I was going to be 50-50 against most builds. I obviously really like facing Crux Merlin because they just don't exert enough pressure against Rye, and they have a difficulty interacting against Rye, even with their defensive tools. Post sideboard with Blanche and Crystallized Destiny. Rye has ways to get around all of that easily, and Majestic Spirit is just blown away by Disorienting Winds and Summon Gale. And with Shattering Discharge being able to break shields, there's no guarantee that Merlin can survive any of the combo pieces that Rye can throw at them in the late game. Now, I wasn't expecting that much Astra Ari and Luxen, but those are generally favorable matchups just because Rye's a lot quicker than these decks, and they're not going to be prepared to handle spell after spell or Arcane Elemental Swing after Arcane Elemental Swing that early in the game. Siryu, this is a favorable matchup just because of Ravaging Tempest. Now, game 1 is going to be a little bit tricky because they've got more turbo pieces than you. If they're able to stop you, or if you don't really have a great opening hand and you don't have Arcane Spell Shield online, or you're not level 3 to use it, the dragon can blow you away game 1. But once Ravaging Tempest is in, and with all the glimpse that you've got between 3 visits, with your Spirit, with Strathskies, typically you'll at least see one of them, and with Charm available as well, you can have Ravaging Tempest active pretty early in the game. And with the dragon blown out, they've pretty much got nothing to do against you, or they're way too slow with ally pressure once the dragon is gone. So typically, I would say this is kind of a win in 3 matchup. But if you both are on pace and you have an Arcane Spell Shield, I would say you're pretty favored game 1 as well. But it's all dependent on if you draw well. Umber Seal can get a little bit tricky depending on what build they have. So I just put on average it's 60-40. But depending if it's fire, if it's water, how many negates they run, it could be closer to 50-50, or if they're more passive, this is probably even more favored than 60-40. Crux Lorraine, not as winning as Crux Merlin because the Clarent offers some level of defense, and they can present some big damage early in the game. But I would say things have to go pretty well their way to be able to set all of that up. And even with the defense that they put into the deck, surviving against Rye's kill line is still pretty difficult. Slimes, I wasn't expecting to see this as much, but with 3 visits, with Advent being able to get around Spell Shroud, with Fluffy Shopkeep providing a little bit of defense, you're typically able to survive the early boards that Slime can present. In the past, it was a little bit problematic because they can turbo up to 3 and launch a big Storm Slime against you. But nowadays, their damage isn't as big, and you have a little bit more defense against their early pressure. So I would say now this is a favorable matchup for Rye. Shadow Strike is kind of the one exception where I would say it's about 50-50. In some builds of Shadow Strike, Rye is probably unfavored. Just kind of depends how many allies they run and some of the tech pieces. But Shadow Strike at the moment, they're not really... I mean, no one's really thinking about Rye if we're being honest. So I think most builds are around 50-50. I mean, it's not like a bunch of specific Rye hate into the board, but with all the incapacitates and some of the defense that they run, it's a little bit tricky. It could be a bit drawn out, but the matchup, I would say the matchup is still about 50-50 just because you've got mixed damage and ways to blow away the the shadow tokens, even with like Ravaging Tempest, for example, so they can't redirect the hits. But it requires a lot of skill to navigate this matchup, and I think for most people, it feels like a losing matchup. And for the remaining ones, they're all non-level 3 decks that more or less I don't really want to face because my deck is more focused on turbo. You could argue some of these matchups are not as bad as they seem. Like if you have the hand, a more defensively oriented hand against like Suzaku, if you've got the heal, if you've got the fluffy shopkeep, against like suited if you see the resolute stand to survive an extra turn, you can take those wins relatively easily. The problem is one, the going first versus going second tempo advantage, and a lot of it is reliant on that. Second, I was only packing 2 resolute stands in the main board. So if I don't really see those, some of those wide board decks can overrun me, and I won't be able to survive the extra turn that I need, especially when I'm going second and I need at least one more turn to be able to catch back up on tempo. Some of these decks like Aetherwing and Fiza, they provide mixed damage, which is a little bit difficult for Rye to deal with. Now, I wasn't expecting to see much Fiza, was not expecting to see much Fractals, and I'm okay with those being my worst matchups if they're not really too common. Fractals, you could argue, might be more 40-60 with the Band of Dissonant Fractal and them being slower, and you get a little bit of healing with 3 visits to kind of push you out of some early burst asunder turns, and with Fluffy kind of blocking some of those Gildas hits. So that matchup could be a little bit better than I had anticipated. And with Razor Gale, on the other hand, that might be a little bit tougher than I had anticipated going into the event. I'm not maining my spell defense like Safeguard Amulet and Blanche. That's part of why I think Fractals was such a bad matchup going into the event, because I don't have those defensive pieces in the main board. Razor Gale as well can run Eternal Magistrate. They have pressure with Cloud Striker as well. So maybe that's more 30-70, and you could say Fractals is more 40-60 given the current state of those decks. But this was kind of my mindset going into the event. And as long as my matchups were more on the top half, which I felt if I stayed in the top tables the later into the event that I went, I would face those upper kind of the 50-50 and favorable matchups the more I was able to keep towards the top tables. Now for the deck itself, I was considering regular Wind Spirit and Fortuitous Wind Spirit. And my consideration for regular Wind Spirit was, do I want interaction against allies early in the game? In fire builds, you have either like Demolition, Nascent Blast, Incendiary Fractal to kind of deal with a bit of ally pressure. With Wind, you're pretty much just reliant on Nascent Blast, and bouncing their allies back isn't really that efficient unless it's an ally that's a bit slow or costly. For example, you can bounce back an Arden and they want to pay with 5 by putting the Arden back on board. That's totally fine. But I thought to myself, I don't think there's going to be a lot of wide boards, especially with Flame Sweep being common, with Crux decks being common. So I put my focus all towards Turbo. With a few pieces of defense, I added 2 Resolute Stand in the main board. I'll cover the main deck a bit later, but that's kind of why I went with Fortuitous Spirit. Fortuitous Spirit also opens up the room to fit in more arcane cards, because with the glimpse power of Fortuitous Spirit, you can craft your opening hand a bit better. You can also cut down on the cards that you need to bridge up to level 3 because you're guaranteed to get a banished level up from Fortuitous Spirit because after you glimpse, you put all your cards in memory. Next, we've got Backup Charger. You've probably seen on some of my stream games, I actually take some of my matchups pretty slow. I go materialize Backup Charger right away if I think that I have the defense necessary to get myself up to level 3. For example, if I see a 3 visits, if I see a Fluffy Shopkeep, if I see Resolute Stand, and I see a Dungeon Guy, maybe I want to keep all of those cards and I want to better craft my banishment. So not only does Backup Charger allow me to gain extra influence, but the tempo loss from taking out Backup Charger taking out Backup Charger as my first materialization is kind of made up with better banishment, and sometimes you can tempo out Dungeon Guide right afterwards to go up to level 2 if you've got bounce effects between Disorienting Winds and Summon Gale, and with Charm you can pay less to be able to bounce it back to hand. You might think it's kind of costly to play Dungeon Guide and try to get Dungeon Guide back during the same turn, but Charm discounts those efficiency cards, making it more easily playable. So depending on the opening hand, that's an option, and especially against matchups where I'm very favored and it looks kind of passive from the opponent's side, the only way I'm going to lose a matchup like that is if I banish poorly and like lose my Dungeon Guide right away. So though, depending on what I have in the opening hand, I just want to make sure I've got all the cards and the banish crafting that I need to go to level 3 to be able to kill them and finish off those favorable matchups. Of course, for the more aggressive matchups, you're not going to have time to get Backup Charter. So it's really dependent on what you see from the opponent. Nullifying Lantern, this is basically the flex spot on what you think you'll face in the meta. I thought about Safeguard Amulet, I thought about Nullifying Mirror, but in the end I went with Nullifying Lantern. And given the matchups that I did face in my run at Niagara, it probably wasn't the right choice because it only came in during one Crux Lorraine, one Aetherwing matchup, and I guess it shuts down Cyclical Breeze for Razor Gale. But given what I saw in the meta with the amount of fire aggro, there's Genbu as well. I do like Lantern against Aetherwing. I think it was the right choice given the meta spread. It was just my run, I didn't really encounter that much of a need to have Nullifying Lantern. Well, like I said, I probably wouldn't change it given what I know about the meta at Niagara. Then you've got Quicksilver Grail and Tome of Knowledge. That combination allows you to banish, allows you to craft your banishing, so not really too much to say there. Tariff Ring, really helpful, gives you another turn against ally boards, and even against Crux Merlin, Crux Lorraine, just being able to shut down Pendragon swings for a turn unless they really want to pay through it, typically buys you another turn without costing you influence there either. So a really must-have card in the deck. Then you've got Arcanist Prism and Storm Tyrant's Eye. You can argue that this might be another flex spot where you don't need both Arcane Regalias to banish off Fluffy Shopkeep. But post sideboard, when I cut down a bit of my Arcane package to fit more defense, I'm more reliant on these cards to be banished in order to enable Arcana Elemental earlier off Fluffy Shopkeep. So I would say overall I did value their inclusion into the build, but depending on how the meta shakes out and if you need more flex cards to deal with certain decks that gain more prominence, perhaps one of these cards can be cut. Now for the main deck. The other win Fortuitous Rye player that kind of inspired me to go this route had a build somewhat similar to this, but I made a few changes to be more oriented around Getting access to the bounce effects earlier with Charm for Dungeon Guide and Fluffy Shopkeep if I needed it to. Also to enable earlier Ravaging Tempest and to enable earlier Advent of the Stormcaller in combination with Power Overwhelming, with Charm and Power Overwhelming. So that was kind of my approach to this deck. I mainly wanted to give a three-pronged offense with Arcane Elemental, with Arcane Blast, and with Advent. And I really like this sort of three-pronged approach because against different decks, you might want to activate a certain route more you might want to go a certain route more commonly than others. For example, against Dragon, I want to be able to have Advent available early to be able to kill the dragon, and without Ravaging Tempest in the main board, Advent is kind of the way I have a chance in the first game if I see the opportunity to eliminate Dragon. Obviously, you can just kill them with Arcane Blast or even Arcane Elemental if their dragon is down after swinging at you. But it gives another angle that the regular Wind Spirit doesn't have in game one. Same against Genbu decks as well, where Advent can also take out Genbu before Ravaging Tempest gets sided in. Another reason why I went with this approach is that I was willing to take the matchup loss against aggressive decks, but I wanted to give myself a chance. And that's why I have 2 Resolute Stands into the builds. With all the Glimpse power between 3 visits with Fortuitous Spirit, as long as I see 1 Resolute Stand against the aggro matchups, oftentimes that is enough to carry me home and set up my kill line once they decided to go all out against me. With Fluffy Shopkeep with 3 visits with Resolute Stand, if I see all 3 components, I have a chance in game 1, even without all my other defensive pieces sided in. And lastly, I guess I would add that the power overwhelmings also help against setting up some earlier Arcane Blast lines, because even when you go to level 3, typically if you have Fluffy Shopkeep, your Arcane Elementals are online early, but your Arcane Blast might not be. And so when you're trying to go for the kill against aggressive decks and you just want to see when you can kill them with just 2 Arcane Blasts, Power Overwhelming helps me get those additional levels to speed that up quicker. Because when you're around level 8, even after scrying, if you have to use Resolute Stand, you're pretty low on influence. But being able to Power Overwhelm into Arcane Blast is just an old school combo of launching multiple blasts at 0 cost. And that kind of helps me close out some early games against aggro. Because to finish them off with Arcane Elemental, you kind of need to see a couple of pieces between Arcane Elemental and a bounce card. And sometimes that doesn't work out that well off a scry. And I just want to give some flexibility in case I see the Arcane Blast and I happen to see a Power Overwhelming as well. That's another route that I can take to finish them off. Then for the sideboard, you've got the spell defense between Safeguard Amulet and Blanche. I wasn't expecting much fractals, so I didn't really want to mainboard Safeguard Amulet. Now, for the winning in against Razor Gale, and I saw some Aries in the top tables, it would have helped in those matchups, but I think even with the sideboard, even if I did have the sideboard, available as part of the main board setup, I think I'm still kind of unfavored against Razor Gale. And R is already a favorable matchup, so I don't really need it. Safeguard Amulet also comes in handy against Faiza, against Suzaku to have a little bit of safety on the spell side. But my thought was you don't really have the tempo to get Safeguard Amulet out. You're kind of wanting to go fast and kill them in return if they can't finish you off if you've got Fluffy, Resolute, and 3 visits. So generally they come in later in the game where if you can't finish them off right away, they can't finish you off right away. So that's why I felt comfortable putting them in the sideboard, as well as just not didn't think I was going to see those matchups as much. Crystallized Destiny to block those big hits from Aetherwing, from Rending Flames, from Dragon as a little bit more assurance. In combination with your Spell Shield Arcanes, you kind of have 6 shields with Crystallized Destiny. Resolute Stand, add a little bit more if you're facing against ally boards, anything that's a little bit more aggressive, Resolute Stands will come in. Vanish from Sight, if they go tall, for example, those Wind Wake Ups can get around, Resolute Stand, they can deal so much damage with one swing that subtracting 3 doesn't really feel like enough. Vanish from Sight shuts down that issue by guaranteeing yourself another turn, because they typically are not going to have True Sight to be able to get through Vanish from Sight. Now, Vanish from Sight means that they're not going to commit the combo against you, because you have to use Vanish from Sight during your opponent's recollection, so they'll know whether or not they need to commit. But this will at least guarantee you another turn, and sometimes that's all you need. And lastly, you've got Ravaging Tempest. What makes Genbu and Dragon a matchup that's doable is because you've got this, you got your backup in killing their Shinju in addition to Advent of the Stormcaller. Now, Advent of the Stormcaller can remove them because Advent is a choose card. Ravaging Tempest, although it's a spell, but it doesn't target. So it's another way of removing the Shinju allies. And sometimes you'll run into opponents where they'll know to keep up their intercept and taunts against Arcane Elemental, and Ravaging Tempest can blow away their taunts and intercepts, and you can't really play them back at fast speed. So that opens up the door for Arcane Elemental to go to town. Now, going through the matchups that I faced at the event, I finished 7-2-3. In terms of the aggressive matchups that I faced, I faced against 1 Wind Allies, which I lost. The problem with my deck is, even if you side all that defense in, it can be quite drawn out if they've got a lot of defense themselves. And so, although I was going to win the second game against Wind Allies, it just took too long, and the turn didn't get back to me during overtime. So that could have been 1-1, but just the problem with the deck is if they're running the innervates, if they're running the veilings, it just takes a lot of back and forth where they stall and you stall with like Vanish and Resolutes, and the game becomes very, very drawn out. I also faced against a couple of Shadow Strikes in the early going, and those were pretty tough matchups. I wasn't really expecting to face 2 Shadow Strikes. One of them being against Asuna, who's a very strong Wind Tristan player, and it was pretty funny. In our game 3, it was looking like I was playing for a draw because he had some allies on board, had a Fluffy Shopkeep on board, and I was resoluting my Fluffy Shopkeep, so it didn't die, and that I wasn't taking any damage. My hand was also not that great, and I had to use Resolute Stand to put stuff in memory. And so when it got to overtime, I basically had the last turn, and it didn't. It basically, I didn't have the greatest banishment. It didn't really look like I had much. But then, as I started going through my turn and I stride into three, I had three careful studies. So at the end, I was just pumping through cards trying to go for lethal. So while he was trying to kill me at game three for the longest time, at the very end, I was trying to lethal him in turn. I just couldn't dig that one more piece of one more one more kill card against them. So fair result, pretty funny game. Very very tough match against a very competent opponent. Then I would say, these other matchups, I faced a decent amount of Merlins. I probably faced the amount of aggro decks I would expect between Wind Ally, Razor Gale, and Aetherwing. I think I think the result was it's a pretty fair end result. I blundered a bit in the Fire Umbra Seal matchup, but that one was a bit of a messy game, and I'll go over that matchup that was on stream in a separate video review. But I had chances to take that game, but I think 1-1 is a fair result just given the messiness that happened in game three. The other tie that I had against Fire Crux Lorraine, I just didn't see the Ravaging Tempest early enough to blow away the taunt and interceptor. So I just really couldn't go for the win between the pressure that they had set up in game three and the Clarent that was out on the field as well. I kept on stalling until I found the Ravaging Tempest, and by the time I found the Ravaging Tempest, time was already called. But overall, I mean, I'm pretty happy with my performance. It was very close. It just one game made the difference, and just being able to contest so closely with top eight, considering where Rai has been in previous metas where we had to deal with the full power of fractals, Icebound Slam, this meta and kind of my run here without I just didn't feel like it was a complete misery going into every single game. I felt I had chances, and that in of itself is a breath of fresh air for Rai. I greatly appreciate everyone kind of listening in to my thoughts on the meta, kind of my reasonings for the deck choice and certain card selections. I actually appeared on stream 3 times. I faced a Shadow Strike, Fire Merlin, and Fire Umbra Seal, and I want to do some videos kind of walking through my thought process in those matchups and kind of some of the situations that occurred that might be a bit puzzling to the viewers. So hopefully I can better explain my thought process there through a separate video. Them bringing me on stream 3 times, I was kind of annoyed. I had triple sleeved my deck, and because they didn't want to show non-GAIP on stream, I had my sleeves were from another video game, and I think you can only bring in like blank generic sleeves, or it has to be GA sleeves. So I had to unsleeve my entire deck, put them in the new sleeves, and that took a long time to set up. And I thought to myself after the first game on stream, should I re-sleeve my deck? And thank God I didn't, because I went on stream for round 8, and if I had to do that whole unsleeving, re-sleeving crap again, I would have just lost my mind. I'm not even sure if people really want to see Wind Arcane, Rai all that much, but I guess they put me on stream because I was like one of 2 Rai decks at the event. Maybe I'll just start playing Merlin so they stop putting me on stream. That way I wouldn't be playing one of these a niche deck that they want to highlight. But I mean, I'm used to stream matchups now, so it's not really nerves or anything. I think a lot of people might enjoy seeing something new in a deck that hasn't seen a lot of success since a couple sets ago. Kind of really show their stuff in this meta. Thank you once again for joining me in this Ascent recap. I will be at Ascent Akihabara coming up in November, and I'm hoping to get those stream recap matches up before then. I will be looking forward to seeing y'all soon at my next video. Goodbye, everyone.